Discussion. Phase 1. Generating the new ways of seeing trigger cards. This phase of the experiment was particularly interesting because of the unpredictable and unexpected imagery each participant submitted. Additionally interesting was the analogy of why their selected image was relevant and the word they attributed to it. All participants had a strong underlying emotional connection to their submitted images. All images and words generated were uniquely different. The majority of participants submitted photographs. This may be due to convenience and time constraints. A mixture of abstract and literal or subject-based imagery, words, a mixture of literal, emotional, sensorial, and a few abstract words. The majority of words were emotional and sensorial. I'd like to highlight, through one example, an observation that is pertinent to all participants. The choice of imagery is generally influenced by the participant's professional background. Most notable is the clear difference in those who work as creatives and those who work in other fields. For example, one image was submitted by a 31-year-old graphic designer from Sydney, Australia. Because I know this person, I can see that the combination of image and word is a reflection of his character and profession. Designers like my friend generally submitted quite abstract images and words, which tend to provoke question and thought. This is not coincidental. It is the result of education and training in aesthetics and visual qualities. Phase 2. Testing the trigger cards in a design workshop. At the beginning, it was interesting to see that some of the designers found it challenging to break away from a known process of brainstorming to try and see things differently and use the cards as inspiration. This particular group of designers is familiar with a workshop process that is very focused and seldom allows for freedom of exploration and fun. The biggest challenge was in letting go of the preconceived assumptions and to become open-minded to adopt the tool and search for new ideas. After approximately 40 minutes, people began to use the trigger cards and opened up a proactive dialogue, which in turn resulted in a flow of ideas. The most significant step forward was when the designers began to see the product as a blank canvas on which they could explore more conceptual ideas through inspiration from the trigger cards. They ceased to think about designing a specific product, but expanded their ideation to product ranges, user experiences, and even potential new business models. Discoveries. Although the contributors are emotionally connected to the trigger card imagery, the images are naturally ambiguous, thus allowing other people to create their own perception. I observed that image ambiguity is important as it catalyzes interpretation, allowing for multiple people to extract different meanings and cross-pollination of ideas through sharing and discussion. One participant quoted that the ambiguity of the images and the process of digesting the imagery was provocative in exploring your own mind. A particularly interesting example of inspiration from an ambiguous image was one designer's interpretation of an image of a cloudscape. The designer had a particular nostalgic interpretation of this image. It reminded him of these days as a student with no money, often walking along the desolate beach in winter and looking out at a stormy skyline. His emotional connection to the image was one of calm, melancholy, mental space and peace. He automatically associated a certain genre of music with the image, Moby's Play album, which then started to give inspiration and trigger ideas for the brainstorming process. This is the time where participants started to connect with the images. Such an observation illustrates that images help trigger memory, a moment in time that allows us to make sense of the image in front of us. The same image can tell different stories to different people based on their sense of memory. The notion of memory in this exercise is particularly important as memory is based on past experiences. which in turn allows for people from different backgrounds to have different associations to the imagery, therefore opening up to a diverse array of thoughts, allowing ideas and content to expand and evolve. Surprising to find was the impact of the word cards. It seemed to me that words were a similarly strong trigger for inspiration. One example of inspiration drawn from the AC/DC card. The most obvious connection and starting point for design ideation was the association of rock music genre. However, quite quickly the designer started to derive a range of iconography that could immediately be translated to sound expression in products. He explored the use of lightning bolts to communicate energy and power running from the music source through the product to the user. This generated ideation around color, product graphics, and form of the product. The designer mentioned that after exploration, he saw possibility to use the ideation to apply to a range of products geared to a range of music genres and lifestyle trends. One can assume that humans think in images, not words. Words are merely representative describers of images. When the mind is presented with words, it translates the word into an image or series of image based on the person's sense of memory. This is what happened in the aforementioned example AC/DC. Upon completion of the workshop and reviewing all the ideation, the designers were asked as to whether or not they felt this was a useful exercise. The question was met with mixed emotion. On one hand, designers felt a little discouraged as this was a new process that they felt they had not yet mastered. It was a process that they were uncomfortable with, and thus they felt uncomfortable with the ideation generated, leading to the question about the quality of the ideas. On the other hand, from my perspective as an observer, I saw the journey evolve from insecurity and doubt into a high-energy ideation workshop. The general consensus among the designers was that the trigger cards provided a new way of seeing and broke away from the standardized way of working. They also agreed that this exercise should be conducted more often to maximize its effectiveness. Conclusion. Aristotle suggests that the imagination bridges the gap between images and ideas. The notion of the imagination is particularly relevant to this experiment. In particular, the first phase celebrated the notion of spontaneity and the unexpected. Surprising to me was the enthusiastic response from a large number of participants. People were enthusiastic to share their view of seeing through new eyes. The content and variety of imagery was largely random and unexpected. However, it was obvious that all the imagery had an emotional connection to the creator. This posed the question about the validity of the imagery for the workshop phase of the experiment. Would the images be too abstract, too disconnected? Would people see something new through these images? Could these images possibly inspire new outcomes? As it turns out, in the second phase, the designers eventually stopped looking for answers in the images, but started to explore the pure essence of the imagery. Instead of thinking in a literal sense, for example, seeing an image of a rocky road and directly translating it into a material and color solution, their thought process became more broad. Instead of designing a specific product, they started to explore the idea of experience and emotion of music. The designer called on memory to make sense of the images and words presented to them. Then they used their imagination to link personal memories and the images to create ideas. The designers were using imagery generated by others from a diverse range of backgrounds for a diverse range of reasons. This, in essence, allowed them to see with new eyes. For future workshops, the designers could use imagery generated by the subject of the research, for example, the user camera studies. This, in turn, would strengthen the notion of seeing with new eyes and provide them with a stronger empathy for the user. Such imagery could be added to the trigger card deck to strengthen its content, and thus strengthening the effectiveness of the workshop phase, providing the value of design research.